I just want to take a moment on behalf of the caucus to update where we are in budget negotiations. For the last 4 days, I have spent hours and hours and hours in a conference room with the governor, the Speaker of the House, the Pro Tem, and Leader Sparks from the Senate Democratic Caucus. And we've been trying to find a compromise when it came to gross production taxes that would be a fair rate for the industry, but would also bring in significant resources to help fund education, healthcare, and public safety in the state of Oklahoma. Our caucus's position has been from the beginning of this negotiation that we needed to bring money in immediately. And that's the reason we set a 5% rate in our Restoring Oklahoma plan that would apply to all existing wells. Under Preston Dorflinger's numbers, that would bring in close to $200 million, between $150 to $200 million. And we said if they choose not to bring any money in to actually help balance the budget next year for education and health care, then they would need to go back to the Oklahoma rate of 7% on all new wells. That's where we were. We started the negotiations. They immediately dismissed our 7% rate out of hand. And after several hours over the last several days, we were offered 5% on all new wells. And we took it to our caucus. The Senate leader took it to his caucus, and our caucuses accepted 5% on all new wells. That wouldn't bring in very much money next year, but we believe that it would set the state's gross production tax rate at a proper level, going back to what it was from statehood for about 70 years. It would set the rate at a proper level so that way when the oil and gas economy continued to grow, the state would reap the benefit for education and health care. Well, when we walked back into the room, they denied that they'd even offered it to us and said that they could only go to 3% on all new wells. Their offer to us at that point was to raise all of $6 million from the industry next year, while they want us to raise over $400 million for middle-class families through their tax hikes on cigarettes and gasoline. Our caucuses dismissed it. We continued to negotiate. They finally said that they would go as far as 4 on new wells, which would only bring in $13 million next year. Mind you, by their own calculations, that's the cost of one well. That's the cost of one new well in the state of Oklahoma. That is all they're asking their oil and gas lobbyists and corporations who are supporting them. That's all they're asking them to contribute to the bottom line for our kids is $13 million. Our caucus said that's not fair. That's not fair to citizens. It's an inequitable balance of the budget. And so what our caucus did is said we will hold firm at 5. We've held firm at 5 for a long time. Not wanting to move off that 5% on all new wells. And at one point, we offered even 4.5% on all new wells as a way to try to compromise even more. They have refused to do it. In fact, even during the negotiations, they even called one of the state's major oil and gas executives and put him on the phone as a way to try to disseminate their information to try to pressure my caucus into voting against our constituents and to voting for a deal that is bad for the state of Oklahoma. And so it is our understanding that they're going to walk away from the negotiation table. Senate Leader Sparks and I are ready to continue talking to try to find compromise at 5%, because we know that if they don't have a cigarette tax or a gas tax or some other of these revenues that they're asking us to support, then their budget won't balance, and they'll have to come back to us and negotiate. We're ready to continue negotiating around 5% or even 4.5%. It is our understanding that they will more than likely run a 4% gross production tax at us with a cigarette tax, and that will not pass. We cannot, in good conscience, ask the citizens of Oklahoma to bear hundreds of millions of dollars worth of tax increases while the oil and gas industry gets asked to contribute $13 million more, the cost of just one well. And so if that's where they're going to be, then we will continue to hold the line because we believe the citizens of Oklahoma have demanded it. Matter of fact, the pressure that we're getting is to go all the way back up to 7%. And my caucus feels that we have compromised significantly in going to 5 on only new wells, and we will maintain that position. If they choose to continue to walk away from the table and not work with us, then we're definitely looking at a special session, and we're asking the citizens of the great state who are watching this today to put pressure on them. Tell them that 4% is not enough. $13 million from the industry is not enough. We can do better. We must do better. The state depends on it. We've said that we want to bring in money immediately. If you went to 5% on all new wells, that's about $150 to $200 million, right? But if you just go to 4% on new wells versus 5% on new wells, we're looking at the long-term perspective. Going to 5% on new wells instead of 4% brings in, once they fully kick in, brings in an additional $70 to $100 million a year. That one 1 percentage point could amount to over a decade being $700 to $1 billion in additional revenue for our schools. And that's what we're fighting for. So it's not over just what we're fighting for next year. We tried to do that in making them apply it to all wells. Once they said they wouldn't do that, well, then the discussion became less about next year, and it's more about the future of the state. And so by fighting from 4 to 5, we're talking about an additional $700 million potentially that could come into the state's revenue coffers for education, healthcare, and public safety over a decade. Those narratives that the oil and gas industry can't afford to pay 5% in Oklahoma just isn't true. Matter of fact, when Larry Nichols called into the negotiations at the governor's request, the 5 of us are sitting there, and she contacts Larry Nichols. I asked Larry, I said, what's the difference in drilling in Oklahoma and Texas in terms of cost? And he said, they're comparable. And I said, Larry, where are Devon Energy's wells right now? He said about 50% in Oklahoma and about 50% in Texas and New Mexico, in the Permian and the Delaware, right? I said, well, tell me the difference between the scoop and the stack, where you guys have your wells now, and then the Permian and the Delaware. He goes, the Permian may be a little bit better, but it's marginal, and so they're pretty comparable. And I said, well, Larry, the gross production tax in Texas is 2 to 3 or 4 times, depending upon how many credits they take, higher than it is in Oklahoma. And he said it is, and then we hung up the phone. And or he said it depends upon your rebates. And so when he hung up the phone, I looked at the governor and the Republicans in the room, and I said, what Mr. Nichols just told you is one of 2 things. That either gross production tax doesn't matter, because if it did matter, they wouldn't have half of their wells in a state that has a 2 or 3 times higher gross production tax than Oklahoma. They'd put them all here, right? Or if gross production tax does in fact matter, then what he has said is that the state of Oklahoma, our citizens, are subsidizing. They're taking the profits of a low gross production tax rate in Oklahoma, and they're using them to subsidize the wells in New Mexico and Texas so their children benefit from it and our kids don't. Either way, the citizens of Oklahoma are getting a raw deal. And so we firmly believe that the gross production tax doesn't matter to that level. Going to 5 will not significantly affect drilling. Matter of fact, I believe it was Larry Nichols' niece who wrote, Katie Richard, or Richard, however she pronounces it. She wrote an article in, she owns Warwick Energy here in Oklahoma, and she wrote an article in Fortune magazine last week in which she said that with the scoop and the stack, at $30 a barrel, they break even. At $30 a barrel. At $50 a barrel, they have a 60% rate of return. When most families are investing their dollars in a bank and are lucky to get a 0.5% rate of return on their money, at $50 a barrel in the scoop and the stack, according to Larry Nichols' niece, and I believe she's his niece because the article said that her great-grandfather helped found Devon Energy. At $50 barrel in oil, which is where we are today, they have a 60% rate of return. And they can't afford to give up 3 percentage points of that for our public school children. I'm not buying it. There's nothing that they couldn't put on the table that my caucus wouldn't at least consider supporting. The Senate Republicans have said out of hand they will never support an income tax increase. We've said we would support an income tax increase and maybe look at something on the fuel side as a way to have a progressive and a regressive tax increase combined together. So you're not balancing the burden on only middle class families. And we believe that even if we strike this deal, they're going to have to come back to the table and negotiate around income tax increases to some extent, or else they won't have enough money. In our negotiations to date, they have been assuming that they would get both a cigarette tax increase and a gas tax increase. Nearly $500 million worth of tax increase on middle-class families, and they're only willing to give up $13 million from the oil and gas industry. I can promise you their assumptions are wrong. And if they want to walk away from the negotiation table and run a 4% rate at us that won't help the state next year and won't help the state long term compared to a 5% rate, then my caucus will continue to stand on the side of the people. We'll continue to stand on the side of our public schools and our people who need access to good hospitals, because their 4% rate next year won't help. I introduced indexing the gross production tax as part of a conversation piece to see if that would be something that they would be palatable with. And what we discovered, having talked to folks in the industry and the Oklahoma Tax Commission after we filed it, was they said it was just unworkable because they would have to determine what the price per barrel was each and every day that the barrel came out. And they said that was just unfair to the Tax Commission and would create instability in the process. And so then I said, fine, then we'll just go to a flat rate, and that's where we are. So we're not being hypocritical. Absolutely, if they want to come negotiate around an indexed gross production tax, we'll have that conversation. But the governor even said in our talks that it's too variable, and she wouldn't like that idea. And so we abandoned it, not being hypocritical. We're just trying to do what's right for the state. You'd have to ask the Republicans as to why they're being so difficult. You have to ask them why they waited until 5 days before or 4 days before revenue had to be passed off the House floor to actually engage us in negotiations. You have to ask them why they thought it was a good idea to cut income taxes and gross production taxes and tax credits and then turn around and make up for those by raising taxes on middle-class families and gas prices and things like that. I can't begin to give get into their head and understand what they're doing. I know what they're trying to do, and that is to balance the budget on the backs of middle-class families, and we just won't support it. I said, if you guys will come to the 5% rate, and we'll help you on the cigarette tax, then we'll go over here and help you on some other areas. Whether that means if there's some of the service taxes that don't hurt middle-class families, we talk about. There's some income taxes. We could talk about those on high-income earners. We talk about the gas tax. I and Leader Sparks have absolutely has been pushing those conversations. But what we get is the Senate Republicans say, well, we'll never do an income tax. So when that goes off the table, then I tell them then there's not much in the way of a progressive taxation system that could get us to support a gas tax, because we're just not going to say let's raise gas taxes and cigarette taxes for a $13 million increase on oil and gas companies. That's just not fair. If the governor and the House and Senate Republicans want to walk away at 4%, want to walk away from the negotiation table at 4%, only asking the oil and gas industry to pay $13 million more next year, while asking middle-class families to pay $400 million more, then we're going to struggle. We're going to struggle getting a budget deal, because our caucus is standing on principle. They're standing on politics. We're standing up for our people. They're standing up for oil and gas executives. Make no mistake about it. The numbers prove that going to 5% on gross production taxes will not have a negative effect on the industry, no matter what they say. Matter of fact, if Harold Hamm's got enough money to put his own employees, to have them come down from the tower at Continental and bust them over here, then he must not be hurting too bad, because if he can afford to pay protesters, then I think he can afford 1% more in gross production tax increases.